Welcome to my channel.
The wind had that peculiar bite to it, which made your ears ache and your nose run simultaneously. A kind of Highland double-edged greeting. Hamish Macbeth, sitting on the battered wooden bench outside Whodunit Hotel, regarded the swirling snow with mild annoyance. He was supposed to be enjoying a quiet evening, ideally with a steaming mug of coffee and perhaps a piece of Mrs. Maclennan's shortbread, yet fate, or rather the constabulary, had other ideas. Towser, his scruffy black and white sheepdog, nudged Hamish's leg with one wet nose, looking up with the solemn expectation only dogs possessed. Hamish sighed and scratched behind the animal's ear. "Aye, lad, I'd rather be inside too. But someone's got to keep an eye on things, eh? The peace of Whodunit, usually broken only by the occasional bleat of a sheep or the cough of an overzealous tourist, was under threat tonight." And by threat, Hamish meant the arrival of Lady Camilla Forsyth Smythe, a Sassenach of the rare kind who seemed determined to make herself noticed by everyone except Hamish. She had arrived that afternoon, alighting from a rented car with the sort of bright enthusiasm usually reserved to Christmas crackers and champagne corks. Now she was marching down the snow-laden street in a scarlet coat that made even the wind pause to stare. She was followed by her assistant, a young man with nervous eyes, carrying an enormous leather bag that probably contained nothing but unnecessary luxuries. "Madam, the village choir rehearses inside the chapel," he called, his voice wobbling slightly beneath her indignant glare. Hamish grunted. He had no intention of attending midnight mass himself. Too many stairs, too many candles, and far too much singing. The only mass he was interested in was a mass of shortbread, washed down with coffee. Yet he knew the Sassenach would likely make a grand spectacle of herself, earning every whispered critique the villagers could muster. And he suspected, though he did not relish, admitting it, that tonight might end with a story worth remembering, or a problem worth ignoring entirely. He leaned back, pretending to be absorbed in the snowflakes curling past his nose. The hotel smelled faintly of burnt toast and cinnamon. Mrs. Maclennan had insisted he keep a candle lit in the doorway, so no one would mistake him for a vagrant. Hamish suspected it was also because she enjoyed the moral superiority of knowing that, even on Christmas Eve, he appeared to be working. Towser's ears pricked up. Footsteps, light but purposeful, approached through the swirling snow. A villager, no doubt, possibly Mrs. Ogilvy, the postmistress, likely on her way to pin the last Christmas greetings to the community board. Hamish gave her a polite nod, which she returned with a suspicious tilt of her head, clearly assessing whether he had eaten anything today. Behind him, the wind moaned around the mountains, a sound that seemed almost mournful in the quiet of Whodunit. Hamish allowed himself a small, secretive smile. Christmas was a time for cheer, sure, but in a village like this, it was also a time when secrets were easier to bury under snow, and rumours easier to feed by the fire, and Hamish, despite his outward appearance of lethargy, had a knack for noticing when something didn't quite fit. Something about Lady Camilla's confident strides, the way the snow clung to her immaculate boots, and the faint smirk she gave anyone who dared look her way suggested trouble. Not that Hamish wanted trouble tonight. He'd hoped for a quiet evening, the wind, the snow, a mug of coffee, and perhaps, if he was very lucky, a silent night. But Whodunit rarely granted wishes. Hamish had just settled back into his bench, Towser at his side, when the first sound reached him, a scream that was at once shrill, indignant, and faintly theatrical. It carried across the snow-laden square, bouncing off the stone walls of the village like a bell clanging for attention. Hamish lifted a lazy eyebrow, expecting perhaps a misstep on ice or an overzealous child playing with a lantern, but the tone suggested something far more deliberate. Towser growled softly, low in his throat, and Hamish muttered, "Aye, lad, I think someone's gone and made a proper mess of their Christmas cheer." The source of the commotion soon came into view. Lady Camilla Forsyth Smythe was at the steps of the tiny, snow-covered chapel, her scarlet coat a beacon against the muted white of the evening. She was standing stiffly, hands pressed to her face, eyes wide enough to frighten any man into a confession he hadn't yet made. The assistant, clutching his leather bag like it contained the crown jewels, skidded across the icy path, nearly colliding with the chapel door before halting with a flustered bow. Hamish pushed himself to his feet, brushing snow from his coat, muttering under his breath about the audacity of rich English ladies to arrive in a sleepy Highland village expecting both awe and obedience. "And on Christmas Eve, no less," he grumbled. Towser slipped ahead, sniffing the ground with interest, tail wagging slowly. When Hamish reached the chapel steps, the sight that met him could have come straight from a cautionary tale told in whispers over peat fires. Mr. Hector MacTavish, a local who prided himself on being the most organised man in Loch Dhu, lay sprawled on the chapel floor in a grotesque parody of a manger scene, his legs bent at unnatural angles, and a single choir hymn sheet fluttering across his chest. His spectacles were askew, one lens cracked, and a bright smear of blood, more dramatic than serious, as Hamish quickly noted, dappled the hem of his coat. "Good heavens, call the police!" Lady Camilla's voice had risen to a pitch that made the snow itself seem to shiver. The assistant fumbled for his phone, hands shaking so violently that Hamish wondered briefly whether he might drop the device or himself first. Hamish approached cautiously, hands raised as if to suggest cooperation without interference. "Mr. MacTavish?" he asked in his usual calm drawl, scanning for any real danger. Towser sniffed the man, then padded back to Hamish's side, deciding that the smell was more startling than threatening. The man groaned, sat up painfully, and waved a shaky hand. It's nothing. Slipped. Ice," he muttered. His tone, however, suggested that he was less concerned about the fall than about the possibility of a scandal, particularly with Lady Camilla watching. Hamish, ever the observer, noticed the little inconsistencies. The sheet over his chest had been carefully folded beneath him, not haphazardly scattered. His gloves were pristine, untouched by the snow, and there was a faint, unusual shimmer on the floor near his elbow, a smear of what looked suspiciously like glitter. Hamish made a mental note. Glitter, he thought, wasn't a Highland accessory. It was something one associated with Sassenach's plays or desperate attempts to impress at a Christmas pageant. Before he could investigate further, the unmistakable sound of a car engine cutting through the wind signalled the arrival of DCI Blair and his team from Strathbane. Blair's vehicle skidded to a halt on the icy square, tyres throwing snow like confetti. He emerged, red-faced, waving a hand in a manner that suggested both authority and irritation at having to leave the warmth of his office for this provincial nonsense. "Macbeth!" Blair barked, the voice carrying the weight of someone convinced that annoyance equaled control. "What in God's name is happening here?" Hamish, who had perfected the art of looking mildly confused while thinking far more than anyone could imagine, gave a small shrug. "Mr. MacTavish has had a bit of a tumble, sir. Nothing major, I think. Though," he trailed off, letting the pause do the work Blair's loud voice never could. Blair stomped forward, fists clenched, turning to his subordinate. "Get a stretcher! Someone call an ambulance! And, Macbeth, stand aside. This is a serious matter, not one of your Highland theatrics." Hamish allowed himself the merest twitch of amusement at Blair's phrasing. Serious, he thought wryly, as if a man's dignity in a choir mishap were comparable to a heist in Edinburgh. The villagers began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Some whispered behind gloved hands, others craned their necks from upstairs windows. The postmistress appeared, frowning over the rim of her spectacles, carrying a tray with a pot of tea as though she had anticipated disaster at exactly this time. Hamish's gaze lingered on her. She had a way of watching the village that always revealed more than gossip. She noted what people didn't say. Blair, ignoring the subtle cues around him, focused on the most obvious culprit in his mind, a young lad who had been loitering nearby, snow clinging to his coat. "You! What are you doing here?" Blair barked. "Answer me!" The boy stumbled back, eyes wide with fear. I was just looking," he stammered. "Exactly," Blair shouted. "Suspicious behaviour. Arrest him." Hamish took a step forward, muttering under his breath. Suspicious. Aye, but hardly murderous. He crouched briefly, examining the glitter smudge near Mr. MacTavish's elbow more closely. His fingers brushed the icy floor, and a small, sharp shard of plastic, or possibly a piece of broken ornament, pricked his skin. He pocketed it discreetly, filing it away in his mind for later. There was more here than a simple slip. Lady Camilla, still fluttering about in her scarlet coat, finally demanded attention. "I insist, this is an outrage. Someone will pay for this." "And where is the police? Oh, you are the police, aren't you? No wonder things are a mess." Blair, affronted that an Englishwoman had dared to criticize his authority, turned beet red. "Madam, I am in charge here. I will handle this without interference from outsiders." Hamish merely leaned against the stone wall of the chapel, Towser resting his head on. Hamish's boot. He sipped from his flask, ignoring Blair's flailing and Lady Camilla's indignation. The boy had been a red herring, the glitter smudge a clue, and the assembled villagers a living map of what the police might overlook if they only listened to those who knew the rhythm of village life. By the time the ambulance had arrived, no emergency thankfully but for appearances, the tension in the square had thickened like a stew left too long on the fire. Blair barked orders, the boy was released with a lecture, and Lady Camilla complained vigorously about the lack of decorum. Hamish, however, already had begun to trace the patterns of the evening, who had been near the chapel, who had been missing from the choir, and most importantly, who had motive to ensure Mr. MacTavish's Christmas ended in a spectacle. It wasn't about crime, not yet. It was about observation, the quiet noticing of what people tried to hide in plain sight, and in Lochdu that was always more dangerous than any armed assailant. Towser nudged him again, as if to remind him that while the world fussed and fretted, the job at hand was still to see clearly, and maybe, just maybe, enjoy a cup of tea before the next incident. Hamish allowed himself a small smile, watching the wind whip the snow in sharp angles, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and wood smoke, and thought Christmas in Lochdu was only just beginning, and trouble, as always, was arriving fashionably late. Hamish returned to the warmth of the Lochdu hotel, Towser padding faithfully beside him, the evening wind whipping up small drifts of snow around their boots. The chapel incident had left him with more questions than answers, and as usual, DCI Blair's loud proclamations had done little to illuminate anything beyond his own ego. Blair had taken the scene over entirely, barking at villagers, issuing commands, and generally creating the impression that crime investigation was equivalent to shouting loudly while stamping. One's boots in the snow. Hamish, on the other hand, preferred subtler methods, sitting quietly, drinking tea, and listening to what people didn't say. The hotel's lounge was empty except for the fire, which crackled with comforting regularity, and Mrs. MacLennan bustling about, ensuring that everything, from the teacups to the air itself, smelled of domestic order. Hamish eased into one of the leather chairs, Towser curling at his feet. "Evening, Hamish. You'll want something hot, I suppose," Mrs. MacLennan said, placing a steaming mug of coffee on the small table before him. She shot him a look that suggested both concern and disapproval. Concern for his welfare, disapproval for his habitual laziness, as she referred to it privately. "Thanks, Mrs. MacLennan." Very civilized, he murmured, inhaling the rich aroma. Towser's tail thumped once against the floorboards, acknowledging the shared pleasure. Outside, Lady Camilla's muffled complaints floated in on the wind, but Hamish paid them no mind. There were more pressing matters, subtle threads of human behaviour that he intended to follow. He began his methodical mooching. First, a visit to the post office, where Mrs. Ogilvy was shelving last-minute Christmas parcels. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, and Hamish knew she would volunteer information if given the chance, usually without realising she was doing him a favour. "Evening, Mrs. Ogilvy," he said casually, noting the faint crease of worry around her eyes. "Busy night, I see." "Aye, too busy for my liking," she replied, placing a parcel carefully on the counter. "But you, Hamish, you're always wandering about when you should be keeping an eye on your village." She shook her head, though a small smile tugged at her lips. "So, the fall at the chapel, was it really an accident, do you think?" Hamish leaned against the counter, allowing Towser to sniff at a stray package. "Hard to say. Could be. But accidents in Lochdu tend to be less accidental than they seem," he said, his voice light, letting the hint of suspicion float without drawing attention. He watched Mrs. Ogilvy's face carefully, noting the quick dart of her eyes toward the chapel steps and the almost imperceptible tightening of her lips. The postmistress knew far more than she admitted. Everyone did. But only Hamish had the patience to piece it together. From there he drifted to the curry shop, where Mr. Ramesh was closing up but still insisting on offering Hamish a small plate of samosas. "You need food, Hamish," Ramesh said, Think of your energy. Investigate. Hamish accepted, chewing thoughtfully. The energy to investigate, aye, he murmured. Though some investigations are best done with tea and talk rather than chasing criminals in the snow. Talking, Ramesh agreed, eyebrows raised. You're clever, Hamish. You notice, you see. Hamish grinned. Or at least I try. He thought of Lady Camilla, her arrogance wrapped in scarlet and her exaggerated reactions, the assistant floundering behind her. And Mr. MacTavish, whose dramatic collapse had been staged, or, if not staged, had certainly been manipulated in some fashion to attract attention. A simple slip? Perhaps, but something in the details did not sit right. The glitter, the perfectly folded hymn sheet, the timing, all suggested a design. By the time Hamish returned to the hotel, the wind had grown sharper, carrying with it the faint sound of Blair continuing his strident interrogations outside. The villagers, as usual, were more amused than concerned. There was the butcher pretending to look busy with last-minute meat preparations, the baker, who had stationed herself near the chapel to watch the spectacle, and a scattering of curious locals peeking from upstairs windows. Hamish made a mental map. Who had been present, who had lingered nearby, and who had the kind of temperament that might enjoy a bit of chaos on a quiet Christmas Eve. Hamish's thoughts were interrupted by the gentle clatter of the hotel. Door. Elspeth Grant appeared, her dark hair dusted with snow, a soft expression on her face that managed to convey both concern and a touch of reproach. Hamish, I thought you'd be at the chapel. You've missed all the excitement. Excitement, Hamish repeated, his tone measured. I've had a front row seat from here. You can learn more by listening than shouting. Elspeth smiled faintly, though her eyes scanned him critically. You mean watching everyone make fools of themselves? Blair is nearly at his wit's end, and Lady Camilla is... well, being Lady Camilla. That's right enough, Hamish admitted, but even as he spoke, his mind was working, placing pieces into the quiet puzzle of human behaviour. He noted, almost absent-mindedly, the slight furrow of Elspeth's brow as she glanced toward the window. She had noticed something. Usually Elspeth had a way of seeing things Hamish might overlook, and often her observations were exactly what he needed to confirm his suspicions or guide them in a profitable direction. Something tells me, Hamish, she said, that the fall wasn't quite the accident everyone thinks it was. Hamish's ears twitched. You think not? I think someone wanted everyone to believe it was an accident, or perhaps someone wanted the attention, the drama, the spectacle. Hamish leaned back, sipping his coffee, eyes narrowing slightly. That was the key, he thought. Humans in Lochdu, as much as anywhere, were predictable. They craved attention, held grudges, and could be provoked to acts that were petty, cruel, or just plain foolish. He had seen it before, and tonight, he suspected, it would play out under the guise of Christmas cheer. Towser stirred, sensing his master's focus, and Hamish gave him a quiet pat. Right, lad. We watch, we listen, and we wait. The truth is there, hiding in plain sight. It always is. And as the snow fell heavier, turning the village into a scene of white hush, Hamish felt that faint thrill of anticipation that always preceded a mystery in Lochdu. There were whispers behind doors, movements just beyond sight, and a certain sense of inevitability that the next act of this Christmas drama would reveal itself soon enough. The village, with all its charm and quiet malice, would soon show its hand, and Hamish, with his deceptively lazy manner, would be ready. By the time the night deepened, the chapel lights casting long shadows across the square, Hamish sat quietly by the window of the hotel lounge, Towser curled at his feet, and sipped his coffee. Outside, Blair's shouting had subsided for a while, replaced by the occasional muttered insult or frustrated stomp. The villagers whispered and speculated, some sneaking glances toward the chapel, others toward the hotel, curious and cautious in equal measure. Hamish, however, remained focused. In the quiet, subtle details revealed themselves, a boot print slightly too large, a scarf caught on a branch, the faint glitter still adhering to the hem of Mr. MacTavish's coat. The clues were small, almost laughable in their simplicity, yet their significance was enormous. Someone had engineered this scene, for reasons that were petty and human, rather than criminal and grandiose. and Hamish, who could appear lazy and distracted while actually seeing everything, knew that unravelling those motives would be the true work of the night. Towser sighed, settling his head on Hamish's boot, and Hamish smiled faintly. He had work to do, but quietly, efficiently, and without attracting Blair's notice. The game had begun, and, as always, Hamish Macbeth intended to win it on his own terms. By the following morning, Lochdu wore a different face. The snow had softened into a light, persistent drizzle, turning the village streets into glistening ribbons of grey. Hamish Macbeth, still in his habitual rumpled coat and scarf, made his way slowly toward the chapel. Towser trotted alongside him, occasionally raising his head to sniff the moist air and sniffle in the damp chill. Despite the festive setting, there was a tension in the village that the weather seemed to echo, a muted anxiety that was just beneath the polite greetings and the muffled laughter of children on Christmas errands. Blair, predictably, was already at the scene, pacing like a caged animal, red-faced and muttering under his breath. He barked instructions at 2 uniformed constables, one of whom tripped over the edge of a frost-covered step. Hamish paused a moment to watch, noting the uncoordinated chaos with a private, quiet amusement. Blair's incompetence was always entertaining, though Hamish never admitted as much aloud. "Morning, sir," he said lightly, stepping into the chapel courtyard, careful not to draw too much attention. Blair glanced at him, fuming. "Morning, Macbeth. I hope you haven't been sitting around with your feet up all night, letting a village descend into pandemonium." Hamish allowed a faint shrug. "I've been observing," he said, letting the word hang in the air. "Sometimes you see more by not moving than by shouting." Towser pressed his nose to Hamish's leg, as if confirming that observation in canine terms. Blair waved him off, muttering something about Highland laziness before turning back to a group of villagers who had begun to assemble. Gossip, Hamish noted, was already circulating. The older women whispered about Lady Camilla's extravagant coat and the curious circumstances of Mr. MacTavish's fall. The butcher complained of missing deliveries, blaming the commotion. The baker rolled her eyes at the children who dared run past the chapel before the frost had melted. All of it was small details, trivial in the eyes of Strathbane police, but exactly what Hamish needed to start piecing together the puzzle. Hamish wandered toward the back of the chapel, where the grass had been trampled by hurried footsteps, snow and mud mingling into a messy canvas. He crouched down to inspect the soil. The glitter smudge he had noticed the night before had now mixed with tiny footprints, too delicate to belong to a man like Mr. MacTavish. Likely, Hamish thought, a woman's shoes, but not Lady Camilla's, nor anyone who had come with purpose or confidence. Someone smaller, more deliberate, and careful enough to avoid notice. Towser's ears pricked, alerting Hamish to a sound beyond the murmuring villagers, a soft, rhythmic tapping, almost like someone shifting weight from foot to foot. He turned slightly and saw Elspeth Grant standing nearby, a notebook in her hands, pretending to sketch flowers in the drab drizzle. Her eyes, however, were sharp, and she caught Hamish's glance with a faint raise of her brow. He nodded slightly, acknowledging that she had seen something as well. "Good morning," she said, stepping closer. "You've noticed the footprints, I take it?" "Aye," Hamish replied, brushing a bit of wet dirt from his coat. "Someone's been careful, or cunning." They walked together toward the street, where the first local shopkeepers were setting up for the day. Hamish had a plan, though it was more of a gentle, meandering strategy than a rigid design. He would talk, listen, and watch. Questions were better posed casually, over tea or a scone, rather than through intimidation. While Blair barked orders, Hamish gathered insights. Mrs. Ogilvy, naturally, had noticed something the previous evening. "It's not the fall itself," she whispered, lowering her voice as if the walls had ears. "It's why he fell, and who made sure it looked spectacular. Glitter, the hymn sheet, the timing. Someone wanted eyes on him." Hamish nodded. "Someone wants attention, or someone wants to hide attention elsewhere," he said, thinking of Lady Camilla and her flair for the dramatic. But that seemed too obvious, too public. No, the design was subtler than that. The culprit wasn't the loud, colourful outsider. They were quieter, more intimate in their interference, and had the sense to avoid the obvious scrutiny. His next stop was the hotel lounge, where he found Ramesh arranging a tray of tea and shortbread. "Morning, Hamish," he said brightly. "Tea? Some ginger scones?" Very kind, Ramesh, Hamish said, accepting the cup. The warmth seeped into his hands and, by extension, his mind. Over tea, he asked casually. Have you noticed anything odd, last night or this morning? Ramesh's eyes twinkled. Odd? Well, Lady Camilla insisted on inspecting every corner of the chapel. She almost touched the hymn sheet herself before I stopped her. And Mr. Mactavish, he seems to have forgotten to mention a certain visitor he had in the choir rehearsal. Hamish raised an eyebrow, sipping his tea. A visitor? Yes, Ramesh said, lowering his voice. He said nothing, but the boy who delivers the papers mentioned seeing someone sneaking out the back, carrying a small box. Nothing alarming, he said, but something about it felt secretive, very secretive. Hamish leaned back, letting the information settle. Every small observation mattered, a hidden box, a visitor not accounted for, and the glitter smeared across the ground. Someone had choreographed a scene meant to misdirect, and while Blair was likely preparing to blame the most obvious suspect, the boy, the shopkeeper, anyone within shouting distance, Hamish already had the faint outlines of the real Patentowser nudged his hand, reminding him it was time to move. Hamish stepped outside, noticing Blair still haranguing the villagers, now accusing the baker of complicity for not monitoring the chapel vigil closely enough. Hamish allowed himself a faint smile. Blair's rage and bluster were constant and predictable, and often they did more harm than good. Elspeth joined him, watching the drizzle wet the roofs and the stone paths. Do you think the person responsible was here all along, pretending to be nothing more than a villager? She asked. Most likely, Hamish said quietly. The clever ones always are. The quiet ones. The ones you least expect. Because they never shout, never parade themselves, and yet they orchestrate the drama from the shadows. The village seemed to hum with life, oblivious to the fact that the next move had already begun. Hamish traced the small details once more, the glitter on the steps, the precise fold of the hymn sheet, the footprints leading away from the chapel and toward the back alley behind the hotel. Each clue pointed subtly, insistently, toward a pattern hidden in plain sight. Something tells me, Elspeth said, that Blair's about to make a terrible mistake. Hamish gave a faint shrug, a wry smile tugging at his lips. He always does. That's why I watch. And with that, he set off down the alley, Towser padding silently beside him, intent on following the subtle traces of human behaviour, gossip, and petty intrigue that would, eventually, reveal the truth. The morning drizzle turned to a fine mist, the mountains blurred in silver grey, and Loch Dhu carried on, unaware that its quiet Christmas had already become a stage for deception, secrets, and observation. Hamish felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. The game had begun in earnest, and while Blair made noise, Hamish would uncover the clues, piece together the motives, and watch as the truth, quiet, inexorable, and entirely Highland, revealed itself. Hamish returned to the hotel, leaving Towser to shake the lingering mist from his fur outside the doorway. The drizzle had lightened to a fine spray, leaving the streets slick with a muted shine. Inside, the warmth of the fire wrapped around him like a familiar coat. Mrs. MacLennan was bustling about as usual, the clatter of crockery and faint smell of cinnamon tea filling the room. The village was starting to settle again, though the tension from the chapel incident lingered, a subtle hum beneath the cheerful holiday chatter. As Hamish took a seat with his coffee, he noticed Elspeth standing nearby, leaning slightly against the mantelpiece, her expression thoughtful. "You're quiet today," she remarked lightly, though her eyes held that characteristic sharpness that made Hamish feel simultaneously observed and understood. "Quiet's good," he said, taking a careful sip. "Gives me time to think, to watch, to notice what others don't." Towser padded over and rested his head on Hamish's boot, eyes half closed in contentment. Elspeth gave a small smile. "Thinking, are you? Or plotting? Sometimes I can't tell with you, Hamish. You've always got a mind in motion beneath that lazy exterior." Hamish allowed a brief smirk. "Aye, well, a lazy face is easier to wear than an active one. No one suspects a lazy man, especially in Loch Dhu." He paused, lowering his voice slightly. "Speaking of suspects, I've been observing, subtly. There's more to Mr. Mactavish's fall than anyone realises." Elspeth's eyes brightened with interest. "Really? I thought it was obvious. A slip on the ice, perhaps a bit of overindulgence with the mulled wine last night." Hamish shook his head. "Not obvious. Intentional, I think." Someone wanted it to look accidental, yes, but every detail points to a design. The glitter, the precise fold of the hymn sheet. Someone staged it to draw attention while concealing something else. Elspeth leaned closer, lowering her voice even further. And you suspect who? Or is it too early? Too early to be sure, Hamish admitted. But there are hints. A visitor to the rehearsal, a box carried sneakily. And the villagers themselves, while oblivious, are giving me clues in what they don't say. He sipped his coffee, letting the warmth steady his thoughts. It's petty, human, not criminal in the grand sense, but dangerous nonetheless. Jealousy, vanity, secret grievances, the kind that make people do foolish things under the guise of Christmas cheer. Elspeth's expression softened, and she touched his arm lightly. You always notice the little things. Sometimes I wonder if you see people better than they see themselves. Hamish's eyes flickered briefly, caught in that delicate tension that always existed between them. Aye, he said quietly, but it's easier to see the truth when you appear not to notice at all. People reveal themselves in ways they think no one is watching. They spoke for a moment in companionable silence. The only sounds the faint clink of crockery and Towser's soft breathing. Then Hamish stood, finishing his coffee with a decisive sip. I'll take a walk, check a few things, listen to a few more whispers. Elspeth followed. You mean mooch? She asked with a teasing smile. Exactly, Hamish replied, with mock solemnity. Mooching is an art form. You gather information without raising suspicion, and in Lochdu, gossip is more informative than any police report. The first stop was the bakery, where Mrs. Sinclair was arranging a tray of shortbread and mince pies. She looked up, startled, then gave a tight-lipped smile. Hamish, dear, you're early today. Haven't heard much, but I did notice Mr. MacTavish arriving unusually flustered yesterday afternoon. He seemed to be hiding something under his coat, like he didn't want anyone to notice. Hamish leaned slightly over the counter, pretending casual interest while filing away the detail. Hiding something, you say? That's intriguing. Did he meet anyone before the choir practice? Mrs. Sinclair shook her head. Not that I saw. But he left in a hurry, clutching that parcel I mentioned earlier, small, rectangular, and when he came back, well, it was much later, and he was more flustered than ever. Hamish nodded thoughtfully. Each fragment, each half-glance and overlooked gesture was building a picture he could almost see in his mind's eye. Thank you, Mrs. Sinclair. Very helpful, he said, slipping a coin into her hand. Towser wagged his tail in approval. They moved on to the chapel's back alley, tracing the footprints Hamish had noted the previous evening. The faint traces of glitter still clung to the wet stones, and a discarded scarf had caught in a branch, partially hidden by frost. Hamish picked it up carefully, noting its softness, colour, and slight scent of perfume. Not Lady Camilla's, he murmured. Something subtler, someone used to moving unnoticed. Elspeth watched him with interest. So we have a hidden visitor, a staged fall, and subtle clues left behind. Who benefits from making Mr. MacTavish look foolish? Hamish's eyes narrowed slightly. Not the obvious ones. It's always someone you'd never suspect, often someone who appears helpful or invisible, and they use the predictable reactions of others to hide their own intentions. Their attention was drawn by the sound of Blair shouting from the chapel steps, this time accusing the postman of complicity for delivering parcels near the scene. Hamish suppressed a chuckle. Predictable, he thought. Loud, wrong, and entirely focused on the superficial. Blair, Hamish murmured, will never notice the clues that matter. Too busy being outraged. Elspeth smirked. Then it's up to you, isn't it? Aye, Hamish replied quietly but carefully. Too much success and I get promoted and shipped off. I like Lochdu just as it is. Lazy mornings, misty hills, and a dog who knows better than most people. They continued walking through the village, speaking in low tones, letting the morning fog conceal them from casual observers. Hamish's mind was active, replaying the details of the previous evening, Lady Camilla's dramatic gestures, Mr. MacTavish's embarrassment, the secretive visitor, and the village's subtle reactions. All of it pointed toward human frailty and a need for attention, wrapped in the guise of an accident. By the time they returned to the hotel, Hamish had a faint outline of possibilities forming in his mind. The pieces were not yet complete, but the edges of the picture were becoming clearer. Someone had orchestrated the chapel scene for reasons neither entirely petty nor entirely innocent, a display meant to provoke, distract, and conceal. Towser stretched, yawned, and nudged Hamish's leg, as if to remind him that while the truth waited to be uncovered, life continued, with its small comforts and subtle rhythms. Hamish patted his dog, allowing himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. He had begun the subtle work of untangling the evening's mysteries. Each step, each observation brought him closer to understanding who had manipulated events and why. And all the while Blair continued to shout from the chapel steps, unaware that the true investigation, the quiet, patient one, was already well underway, guided by a police constable who appeared lazy, unremarkable, and entirely ordinary, but who saw more in a glance than most detectives could in a week of interrogation. Hamish smiled faintly to himself. The game had begun in earnest, and he intended to see it through, at his own pace and in his own way. Hamish spent the late morning in a leisurely patrol of the village, though, as always, his movements were purposeful in their own subtle way. He stopped at the small bookshop first, nodding politely at the proprietress as he examined a display of calendars. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted a stack of postcards, and Hamish, through years of observation, noted the hesitation, the little tells that villagers gave when something weighed on them. "Busy morning?" he asked casually, keeping his tone light, letting her reveal what she wished. "Oh, Hamish," she murmured, glancing nervously toward the chapel. Well, you know, everyone's talking. About the fall, about who might have... Well, you know." Gossip travels fast," Hamish replied, tilting his head. "And yet, sometimes it hides more than it reveals." He noted the slight twitch of her fingers and the way her eyes darted toward the back of the shop. Subtle, he thought. There's more here than she's letting on. Next he drifted to the butcher's, where Mr. Campbell was cleaning the knives, muttering to himself about missing deliveries and the inconvenience of snow. Hamish leaned casually against the counter. "Busy day, Campbell?" he asked, keeping his tone conversational. "Hamish, I swear these holidays bring nothing but trouble," the butcher grumbled. "Yesterday, with all that commotion, deliveries were late, stock moved, and everyone's making mountains out of molehills." His eyes flicked toward the chapel and then back, as if he feared being overheard. Hamish caught the movement and the subtle emphasis on words. "There's a worry here," he thought. "Something small matters." He noted the faint scuff marks on the floor near the delivery entrance. Not from Mr. MacTavish, not from Lady Camilla, not from Blair's entourage, but from someone much lighter, careful, deliberate. Someone who had moved through the village like a ghost, leaving traces intended to be overlooked. Hamish moved on, toward the post office, where Mrs. Ogilvy was tending the counter, sorting the incoming mail. "Morning, Hamish," she said, with the faintest edge of worry in her voice. "People are talking, even the young ones. Something about that visitor carrying a box. Odd behaviour, if you ask me." "Box?" Hamish repeated, leaning casually. "Do tell." She hesitated, glancing around, then leaned in. "I didn't see much, just that he came and went without anyone noticing. Mr. MacTavish seemed keen to keep it quiet. And the glitter, there was a tiny bit left on the steps this morning, as if someone wanted it noticed, but not really." Hamish smiled faintly, sipping from the flask he always carried when on such investigations. That was it, the subtle misdirection. The glitter was a signal, small, almost laughable, intended to draw eyes away from the real detail. He made a mental note to trace where the box had gone, who had handled it, and why it mattered. The day passed in this slow, methodical manner. Hamish moved from shop to shop, quietly questioning, observing, and noting contradictions. Mrs. Sinclair at the bakery mentioned Mr. MacTavish had seemed unusually tense before choir rehearsal, yet claimed to have been alone. Campbell, the butcher, hinted that someone had passed by with a parcel early in the morning, yet no one could recall who. The postman muttered something about seeing a fleeting figure in a dark coat near the chapel, though he was unsure of the details. Each observation alone seemed trivial, almost accidental, but together they formed a faint, persistent outline. Elspeth joined him again as he returned toward the hotel for a late tea. "You've been busy," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Did you discover anything interesting?" "Aye," Hamish replied, leaning against the doorway. "Nothing obvious. Everyone's lying in a way. Not outright, of course, but the half-truths, the things left unsaid, they're shaping a story. The story is clearer than the words themselves. Someone arranged Mr. MacTavish's mishap with more thought than we first imagined." Elspeth's eyes narrowed. "Do you think it's malicious, or just mischievous?" Hamish considered, sipping his tea. "Human nature, Elspeth. Not purely malicious, not purely playful. Jealousy, vanity, the need to impress, perhaps to humiliate discreetly. It's about the subtle satisfaction of seeing someone stumble while hiding the hand that nudged them." Towser rested at his feet, and Hamish allowed himself a brief glance out the window at the chapel steps. Blair's team had not moved on, continuing their ineffectual probing and shouting, while villagers watched from doorways, whispering, speculating, enjoying the quiet chaos. Hamish's eyes traced the wet stone, noting the tiny detail. The faint shine of the scarf still caught in the branches, a slight indentation in the snow that didn't match any official movements. "The box," Hamish murmured, more to himself than Elspeth. "It's the key, and whoever carried it wanted no one to see them." He tapped the rim of his coffee cup thoughtfully. It's easy to misdirect with glitter and theatrics, but people leave traces no matter how careful. And in a small village like this, the tiniest slip becomes meaningful. Elspeth tilted her head. "So, what now? Wait? Watch?" Hamish smiled faintly. "Exactly. Listen, observe, and wait. Let the village reveal itself. The truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, like a footstep in the snow no one notices, or a confession in a whisper." He spent the afternoon weaving through the streets, visiting the hotel kitchen, the bakery, the post office again, always taking the time to chat casually, to ask seemingly innocent questions, and to notice the smallest inconsistencies. Each half-glance, each hesitated answer, each fleeting motion told him more than Blair's shouted interrogations ever could. The morning's observations were coalescing into something faint but tangible, a pattern of behaviour, a network of small lies, and the invisible hand behind Mr. MacTavish's embarrassment. By late afternoon, the village seemed almost normal again. Shops had reopened fully. Children's laughter echoed down alleys, and the drizzle had eased into a gentle mist that blurred the rooftops and softened the mountains into shadowy silhouettes. Blair, still red-faced, had managed to coax a confession from the terrified delivery boy, who insisted he had done nothing except run errands, and Hamish suppressed a smile at the predictable misdirection. Towser nudged his hand, reminding him that while the world fussed and fretted, there were still traces to follow, still whispers to catch, and still secrets hiding in the ordinary movements of villagers. Hamish rose, stretching, letting his eyes linger on the fading light. The day's observations had narrowed the field considerably. Someone had staged the chapel incident for attention or concealment. The glitter, the folded hymn sheet, the visitor, the mysterious box, all pointed to someone clever, subtle, and very human. Hamish allowed himself a quiet thrill of anticipation. He would not confront anyone yet, not until the threads of motive and action were fully visible. Blair could shout, the villagers could whisper, Lady Camilla could preen. Hamish would move with patience. The village, in all its fog, snow, and quiet intrigue, would reveal the answer to those with eyes to see. And in Loch-Dhu, as always, Hamish Macbeth had eyes no one suspected. The evening began to settle, the mist curling around the chimneys and curling the rooftops in ghostly outlines. Hamish sipped his tea again, Towser at his feet, listening to the village breathe in its calm, deceptive rhythm. Each detail, each overlooked motion, each casual remark had its place. The next move, he knew, would reveal itself soon. And when it did, he would be ready, not in haste, but in the deliberate, observant way that had solved more mysteries in Loch-Dhu than anyone cared to admit. The mist thickened as afternoon gave way to early evening, curling around the rooftops and muffling the sounds of Loch-Dhu. Hamish Macbeth wandered slowly through the square, Towser padding silently beside him, ears pricked for any shift in the village's rhythm. Blair was nowhere in sight, probably still berating someone for some imagined transgression at the chapel, and Hamish allowed himself a quiet, private grin. Sometimes the best way to understand people was to watch what they did when authority wasn't glaring over them. He stopped at the edge of the bakery, peering into the window where Mrs. Sinclair was busy arranging pastries for the evening trade. She glanced up at him, lips pressed together in a mixture of annoyance and fondness. Hamish nodded, greeting her casually, and she lowered her gaze back to the counter, muttering something about chaos, even in Christmas. He noted the precise way her hands lingered on the tray before returning to their usual work. Deliberate, measured, careful. Habit, perhaps, but habit often concealed truths in Lochdu. Tausa growled softly at a figure crossing the square. Hamish looked up and saw the delivery boy from the previous day, carrying a small package with a frown that suggested he had been scolded by Blair more than once. "Evening, lad," Hamish called lightly. "Running errands again?" The boy glanced nervously, then shook his head. "Just taking things back," he mumbled. "Nothing to do with what happened yesterday." Hamish let the remark hang. "Aye, nothing at all. But sometimes the smallest hands carry the largest stories." He watched the boy move on, noting the way his boots left uneven tracks in the softening snow. Slight, light, and careful. Hamish turned his attention back to the chapel steps, now empty except for a scattering of glitter and a single hymn sheet fluttering in the breeze. Something about the precise fold had bothered him since the beginning, and he crouched, brushing his fingers lightly along the edge. The fold wasn't natural. Someone had arranged it. The glitter wasn't random either. It had been placed as a distraction, meant to catch the eye and obscure the real action, like a flourish in a play. From the corner of his eye he noticed Blair arriving, red-faced and flustered, followed by 2 constables. They immediately began interrogating a woman who had been quietly observing from her doorway. Blair's focus, as always, was loud, obvious, and completely misdirected. "Where were you when Mr. Mactavish fell?" he demanded, jabbing a finger toward her. "You saw something, I know you did." The woman blinked, confused and flustered, shaking her head. I just came out for a walk, sir. I didn't—" Blair cut her off, yelling over the drizzle and mist, convinced he had uncovered the culprit, while Hamish stepped back, letting the scene unfold. The obvious suspect, the one most likely to draw attention, was being interrogated, and Blair was about to cement a narrative entirely at odds with reality. Hamish smiled faintly to himself. Predictable, as always. He wandered toward the back alley again, Tausa padding alongside, sniffing at a patch of wet stone. Glitter had faded, but faint traces of perfume lingered on the scarf caught in the branch. Hamish crouched, letting his nose detect the faint but distinct scent, a subtle floral, not overpowering but deliberate. Someone had been careful. Someone had staged a scene with precision, and the intended distraction was working exactly as planned. Elspeth arrived quietly, moving to stand beside him. "You still tracking the clues?" she asked softly, voice barely above the mist. Hamish nodded. "Aye, the fall was the spectacle, the distraction, but the real action, the motive, the manipulations, are elsewhere. Someone engineered the chaos to hide their hand, and Blair is about to take the wrong person in." Elspeth glanced toward the square, where Blair continued to lecture the woman. "You think he'll notice in time?" Hamish shook his head, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Not unless I show him, and I've no desire to. Let him bluster. I'm more interested in finding the truth quietly. You see, Elspeth, the village itself will betray the culprit if you know where to look. People always leave traces." Their eyes fell on the small, rectangular parcel that had been returned to the chapel steps, likely forgotten in the chaos. Hamish knelt, examining it carefully. The wrapping was plain, the corners neat, and the seal intact, though the paper had faint creases suggesting it had been handled. Inside, he could just make out the shape of a small box, its edges sharp and precise. A clue. The first tangible one that pointed to someone's involvement beyond mere observation. Hamish rose, slipping the package into a cloth bag he always carried for evidence, or, more accurately, for things worth noting. Tausa wagged his tail, approvingly, as if acknowledging that the hunt was beginning in earnest. They continued their observations throughout the village. Mrs. Ogilvy revealed that she had seen a fleeting figure slipping behind the chapel early that morning, and a stray comment from the baker hinted that someone had been unusually interested in the choir rehearsal, asking about who would be present and what Mr. Mactavish was planning. Each detail added weight to the growing suspicion that the staged fall had a purpose beyond embarrassment, a hidden message, a concealed grievance, or perhaps revenge delivered with quiet theatricality. Hamish noted inconsistencies in the villagers' accounts. One mentioned seeing the same figure near the chapel steps at a different time. Another swore no one had been there at all. The contradictions were subtle but telling. People often misremembered, sometimes deliberately, and each half-truth nudged Hamish closer to the real story. The red herrings were plentiful, Blair's obvious suspect, the scared delivery boy, even Lady Camilla herself, but none of them fit the pattern of precision, subtlety, and patience evident in the traces left behind. By evening, the village had settled again into a hushed routine. Lights flickered in windows, smoke drifted lazily from chimneys, and the mist softened the outlines of rooftops and mountains. Hamish and Elspeth sat quietly in the hotel lounge, sipping tea. He laid out his observations, carefully connecting the dots, the parcel, the glitter, the folded hymn sheet, the perfumed scarf, the fleeting figure. "The person responsible," he said softly, "is clever, patient, and subtle. They wanted attention to go elsewhere while they acted unseen. And they underestimated how observant the village can be if you pay attention to the right details." Elspeth nodded thoughtfully. "So the red herring, the one Blair is focusing on, is completely innocent." "Aye," Hamish confirmed. "And Blair will be far too busy congratulating himself to notice, but we'll see eventually how carefully the real culprit has hidden their hand. It's always in the small things, the overlooked gestures, the faint traces of presence, that the truth lies." Towser stretched, rolling onto his back by the fire, and Hamish allowed himself a rare smile. He had identified the first key inconsistencies, begun eliminating the obvious misdirections, and gathered the clues that would, in time, reveal both the motive and the perpetrator. The village of Whodunit, with its quiet rhythms and subtle betrayals, was already speaking to him, one half-whisper, one unnoticed footprint at a time. And as the wind sighed through the mist-laden streets, carrying faint laughter and the smell of pine, Hamish Macbeth settled back in his chair, hands wrapped around his tea, knowing that the game was moving forward, and that soon the carefully constructed veil of deception would begin to unravel, quietly, under his watchful eye. The following morning, Whodunit emerged from the mist with a quiet stillness, as though the village itself was holding its breath. Hamish Macbeth stepped out into the damp streets, Towser padding loyally beside him, ears flicking at every distant sound, the creak of a shutter, the distant barking of a dog, the faint clatter of a kettle on a back hearth. The chill in the air was sharp but invigorating, and Hamish welcomed it. The cold made people move carefully, and careful movement often revealed more than they intended. His first stop was the chapel, now cordoned off with nothing more than a polite, unofficial rope of string. Blair was nowhere in sight, having likely retired to the hotel to dictate his latest theory, which would inevitably blame the most obvious suspect. Hamish crouched near the steps, examining the faint scuff of the perfumed scarf in the mud and the remnants of glitter that still clung to the stone. The details were deliberate, almost theatrical, yet they seemed designed to mislead. The real story lay in the subtle inconsistencies, the gestures, the hesitations, the interactions, that others overlooked. Elspeth appeared silently beside him, her presence always reassuring. "You're early," she remarked, adjusting her scarf. "I take it the village has more to tell than Blair suspects." "Aye," Hamish replied softly. "Blair is busy hunting shadows. We, however, will see the substance beneath the misdirection." He tapped his fingers against the scarf lightly. "The traces are faint, but deliberate. Whoever did this wanted to appear invisible, yet they left just enough to be noticed by someone paying attention. It's clever, human, and petty all at once." They moved toward the back alley behind the chapel, where the morning light caught on a faint shimmer of frost. Hamish noticed the small rectangular parcel he had bagged the previous evening, now showing signs of moisture from the drizzle. The box had been handled, but carefully, its edges slightly softened, its contents likely shifted just enough to suggest tampering. He crouched to inspect it further. "This isn't the kind of thing done for simple amusement," he murmured. "It's a message, or a warning, or perhaps a rehearsal for something larger, and whoever carried it wanted no one to know." Elspeth peered over his shoulder. "A message? To whom?" Hamish smiled faintly, sipping from his flask. "To someone who would notice the fall, the glitter, the dramatic collapse." The spectacle is intended to draw attention elsewhere, away from the true intent. The person responsible thrives on subtle humiliation, or perhaps secret satisfaction. But who? Their investigation continued through the morning, moving slowly among the village shops. Each stop offered small revelations. Mrs. Sinclair at the bakery confirmed that Mr. MacTavish had seemed unusually tense before choir practice, and that a visitor had been there briefly, a detail he had noted but now understood more fully. The postmistress hinted at fleeting glimpses of a figure in a dark coat moving with deliberate purpose, while the butcher muttered about. Deliveries shifted at odd hours, the timing too precise to be coincidence. It was at the hotel, over a shared plate of ginger scones and steaming tea, that the first hint of a hidden motive emerged. Hamish laid out the details carefully for Elspeth, his tone casual yet measured. The fall was the distraction, the parcel, the visitor, the glitter, the folded hymn sheet, all of it points to someone who wanted attention deflected. And the question isn't how they did it, but why. People rarely act like this without reason, and the reason is usually human, not grandly criminal. Elspeth listened, eyes narrowing. So it's not theft or vengeance in the usual sense? Not exactly, Hamish said. It's smaller, subtler, but just as powerful. Humiliation, jealousy, envy, old grudges, secret flirtations. Human pettiness dressed up as accident or oversight. That's what we're chasing. Towser shifted at his feet, nudging Hamish's leg. Hamish smiled faintly. Even Towser can sense it. There's an intention here, a personality behind the performance. And it's always someone we wouldn't expect. Someone who blends in, who pretends helpfulness while orchestrating the scene. They left the hotel to continue their quiet reconnaissance. Hamish wandered the streets, noting the villagers' behaviour with a careful eye. Blair, predictably, was shouting at someone near the chapel, convinced he had cornered the truth. Lady Camilla, meanwhile, fluttered about in her scarlet coat, inspecting everyone as if the village were a stage and she the director. Hamish allowed himself a faint chuckle. Predictable chaos, all serving as an unintentional smokescreen. As they moved past the chapel, Hamish noticed a faint disturbance in the gravel near the side gate, footprints almost too small to be significant, but aligned with the direction the parcel had been carried. He crouched, examining them. They were light, careful, deliberate, and critically, unconnected to anyone officially accounted for in Blair's narrative. Someone moved the box after the fall, he murmured to Elspeth. A second act of misdirection. That's clever. And it suggests intent beyond simple mischief. Elspeth's eyes widened. So the person is not just playing with Mr. MacTavish, they're playing with everyone else's perception too. Exactly, Hamish said. And that's where we find the motive. They wanted to humiliate, to manipulate, and perhaps to hide something that only they could understand. The trick is seeing past the spectacle to the subtle clues, the misdirections, and the personality behind them. Towser barked softly, drawing Hamish's attention to a shadow moving across the street. A figure paused near the chapel, glance flicking toward the alley, then moved on with the quiet precision of someone accustomed to being unnoticed. Hamish noted the movement without reaction, simply marking it in his mind. The pieces were aligning. By late afternoon, Hamish had collected enough subtle evidence to outline a tentative theory. The fall had been engineered, the parcel moved deliberately, and the attention drawn to Lady Camilla, the choir, and the village at large was a distraction from the person who had orchestrated it all. It was petty, human, and profoundly deliberate. The culprit was someone who thrived in the shadows, using misdirection as a cloak and the village's predictability as camouflage. As the mist thickened into early evening, Hamish and Elspeth returned to the hotel lounge, settling by the fire with tea and shortbread. Towser curled at their feet, half asleep, while Hamish outlined his observations. "We have the actions," he said softly. "We know the misdirections. The next step is seeing the motive clearly, who benefits, who loses, and why. That's where the trap will be set." Elspeth nodded. "And Blair?" Hamish allowed a faint smile. "Blair will take his own path, loud, red-faced, and certain of being correct. We, however, will see what the obvious misses. The truth is always in the quiet details, the whispers, the footprints, the little gestures. And Loch Dhu, with its habits and rhythms, never lies for long." Towser stirred, raising his head, and Hamish patted him gently. "Right, lad. Tomorrow we follow the subtle movements, the human tendencies. The game is reaching the stage where the culprit reveals themselves, or thinks they have already hidden their hand. And that, Elspeth, is when the fun begins." The village outside softened in the evening mist, lights glowing warmly in windows, smoke drifting from chimneys, and the mountains blurred into silver-grey silhouettes. Hamish sipped his tea, enjoying the warmth and the anticipation. He had found the red herrings, traced the misdirections, and now the hidden motive was beginning to emerge, faint but insistent. In Lochdu, the quiet, patient, observant constable always held the advantage, and Hamish Macbeth intended to use it fully. The next morning dawned pale and brittle, with frost painting the village roofs in silver and the mountains looming silently above. Hamish Macbeth stepped into the chill, Towser at his heels, nostrils twitching at the faint traces of yesterday's bustle. The village seemed almost frozen, not just by the cold, but by the unspoken tension lingering in the aftermath of Mr. MacTavish's spectacle. Blair, as expected, had already set himself up in the hotel lounge, red-faced and muttering to anyone who would listen about his supposed progress, while Hamish moved through the streets with quiet purpose, noting small signs, the shift of a curtain, the careful way a door was closed, the glances exchanged at shop counters. Hamish's plan for the day was simple, subtle provocation. He needed the culprit to reveal themselves without direct confrontation, and that required gentle manipulation of perceptions. He started at the chapel, ostensibly to inspect the scene again, but really to watch the villagers' reactions. People moved differently when they thought they were alone. He reminded himself. Their true motives often emerged in the pauses between words or in fleeting gestures. As he crouched by the chapel steps, Towser sniffing the edges of the path, Hamish noted Lady Camilla arriving in her usual flamboyant coat, carrying a muff that seemed far too ornate for the misty streets. She stopped, glanced around theatrically, then began arranging hymn sheets as if supervising a rehearsal. Hamish allowed himself a quiet smirk. The distraction she provided was perfect. Any overt attention she drew would allow the subtle players to move unseen. Elspeth appeared again, standing quietly in the background, observing the villagers as Hamish had trained himself to do. "You're letting her play her role," she whispered. "Aye," Hamish said softly. "She doesn't know it, but she's a perfect pawn. Everyone sees the obvious. The subtle ones think they're safe." He crouched, brushing a gloved hand along the frost-kissed stone. Tiny footprints, delicate and precise, led from the chapel side gate toward the hotel alley, small, cautious, almost reverent in their careful placement. The next few hours passed in deliberate observation. Hamish moved from shop to shop, asking idle questions in the gentlest, most casual manner, listening to every hesitation, noting each contradiction. Mrs. Sinclair, a bakery, offered an offhand comment about a fleeting figure near the chapel last night, who had seemed in a hurry, yet measured. Campbell at the butcher mentioned that a parcel, small and heavy, had been moved carefully before any of the chaos began. Even the postmistress, usually tight-lipped, allowed a hint slip. Someone had asked her who would be at choir practice yesterday, their tone too casual to be accidental. By mid-afternoon, Hamish had pieced together a subtle pattern. The culprit had engineered the fall as a spectacle, orchestrated the parcel's movement, and left tiny distractions, glitter, a perfumed scarf, misfolded hymn sheets, to draw attention from themselves. Their intention was not robbery nor violent revenge, but manipulation, humiliation, and the concealment of a small, deeply personal secret. Each villager's behaviour, every half-truth and evasive glance, confirmed this growing theory. Towser nudged his hand, drawing Hamish's attention to a shadow moving along the alley behind the hotel. A figure paused, glanced toward the chapel, then moved on with careful steps, pausing as if to check for witnesses. Hamish noted every detail, the coat, the gait, the hesitant hand brushing against a door frame. Subtle, controlled, confident in the assumption that no one was watching. Elspeth crouched beside him, eyes narrowing. "Do you think they're aware you're observing?" "Doubt it," Hamish said quietly. "They think they've been invisible. But the clever ones always leave just enough. The glitter, the folded sheet, the misplaced parcel, it's their signature, unintentional or otherwise." Hamish decided it was time to set a gentle trap. He started by spreading a whisper through the hotel's staff and shopkeepers, a rumour that the parcel had been misplaced again, left near the chapel steps, and that someone had been seen retrieving it. He did so in casual, almost careless tones, careful to seem as if he were sharing village gossip rather than setting a lure. Every word was measured to provoke the culprit without alarming the rest of the villagers. Within the hour, subtle signs of nervous activity began to emerge. Lady Camilla fussed over a stray hymn sheet, muttering about tidiness, while Mr. MacTavish fretted in a corner, wringing his hands. And then Hamish noticed the figure again, the same careful, quiet motion, moving along the side alley as if to investigate the rumour, their movements betraying a mix of caution and curiosity. Hamish followed discreetly, moving with Towser alongside, keeping to shadows, while Elspeth maintained her quiet observation from the hotel doorway. The figure approached the chapel steps, paused, glanced toward the square, then carefully examined the parcel. Their hands lingered over it, hesitating for a moment too long, betraying the inattention of someone balancing risk and necessity. Hamish whispered to himself, "Aha! There it is, the first real slip." The person's careful manipulation had begun to falter. The rumour, the gentle prodding of the villagers' attention, had caused a tremor in their controlled actions. They were human, after all, and human beings, no matter how clever, made mistakes under pressure. The figure straightened, then abruptly turned toward the hotel alley, moving faster now, as though the momentary pause had unsettled them. Hamish noted the slight falter in their gait, the subtle twitch of the hands, the almost imperceptible glance toward the chapel square. The trap was working. The culprit was reacting, showing that the careful orchestration of the fall, the parcel, and the distractions had not accounted for this quiet, persistent attention. Elspeth leaned close. "You think it's enough to flush them out?" "Aye," Hamish replied softly. "Not completely yet, but close. The next move is theirs, and we're ready to see it. Patience, observation, gentle provocation. This is where the cleverness of Lochdu helps. The village itself becomes a mirror, reflecting the culprit's anxiety back at them, and the more they think they're hidden, the more they betray themselves." The late afternoon light softened into a hazy gold, filtering through mist and frost, casting long shadows across the streets. Blair, still oblivious, continued to parade an innocent villager before the public eye, convinced of his own insight. Hamish let the scene unfold, knowing that real progress required subtlety, not bluster. Towser nudged his leg, as if approving the slow, deliberate pace of the hunt. Hamish sipped his tea from a thermos, eyes flicking to the subtle cues of the village. The culprit had reacted to the planted rumour. They had shown tension, hesitation, and the faint tremor of fear or excitement. Soon, the final misstep would come, and Hamish, quiet, unassuming, and endlessly observant, would be ready to act. Pieces of the puzzle were aligning: spectacle, misdirection, motive, and human frailty. All that remained was the final act, the revelation, the confrontation, and the unmasking of someone who had thought themselves invisible. As dusk settled and the mountains darkened into shadowy silhouettes, Hamish allowed himself a small smile. The trap was set. The subtle pressures of the village, the half-whispered rumours, the careful observation, all were converging. And when the culprit moved again, they would move into the very spotlight Hamish had arranged, unwittingly revealing the truth. In Lochdu, as always, appearances were deceptive, and Hamish Macbeth was patient enough to let them betray themselves entirely. The dusk mist hung low over Lochdu, curling around the cottages and church spire like a gauzy curtain, and Hamish Macbeth moved silently along the wet cobblestones, Towser at his side, ears alert to every sound. The village had quieted, the shops shuttered, the last traces of tourists and curiosity seekers retreating indoors. Blair naturally was still in the hotel lounge, expounding loudly on the merits of his theory, red-faced and imperious, while Hamish's attention was entirely elsewhere. He had planted the subtle rumours, let the villagers murmur, and now he simply watched. From a shadowed doorway, He saw the figure approach the chapel steps once more. This time, the movements were tense, jittery, betraying the careful composure of someone accustomed to control. Hands fidgeted, eyes flicked nervously toward the hotel windows, and a glance toward the square revealed a momentary panic. Footsteps approaching, voices murmuring, and yet no one else truly observing the minute signs of unease. Hamish allowed himself a faint smile. The trap was working exactly as intended. Elspeth joined him quietly, her presence steady. "They'll give themselves away soon," she murmured. "Aye," Hamish replied softly. "And when they do, it'll be because they believe they're still hidden. That's the beauty of subtlety, overconfidence." He crouched slightly, watching as the figure bent over the parcel, hesitating, then reaching for it with trembling hands. Towser growled softly, tail stiffening, alerting Hamish to the faintest shift in the figure's posture. The culprit had not noticed the constable crouched in the shadows, ready to observe every move. Hamish could see it now, the glimmer of fear in the eyes, the tight grip on the parcel, the way the figure glanced over the shoulder repeatedly as though expecting to be followed. "Now," Hamish whispered to Elspeth, who gave a barely perceptible nod. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped from the shadows, moving closer, voice calm, carrying the soft authority of someone entirely unthreatening yet in complete command. "I think that belongs to you," he said gently. The figure froze, spinning around with a startled gasp, the parcel nearly dropping. It was clear now that Hamish had been right all along. The fall, the parcel, the glitter, the folded hymn sheet. Everything had been orchestrated by this person. A surge of panic swept over them. Hands trembled, breath came quickly, and they backed toward the alley wall as though it could shield them. "Who else knows about this?" the culprit demanded, voice wavering, eyes darting nervously. "Only those who notice what others don't," Hamish replied evenly, Towser stepping forward but remaining calm. "The village, the snow, the footsteps. You left a trail, even when you thought no one was watching. And I've been watching." For a moment silence reigned, broken only by the soft patter of residual drizzle and the distant chime of the chapel bell. Then, in a frantic gesture, the culprit made to flee, clutching the parcel tightly. Towser barked sharply, and the dog's sudden movement startled them, causing a stumble into the alley wall. Hamish moved with precise, practiced calm, intercepting the path, speaking in the soft, controlled tones that belied his casual appearance. "It's over," he said. "No need for more theatrics, just hand it over." Panic shifted into desperate calculation. The culprit's eyes darted toward the square, toward the hotel windows where Blair might have appeared. But Blair was safely ensconced in his own bluster, oblivious to the actual proceedings. The figure realized too late that the web of observation they had underestimated was complete. Every subtle trace had been noted, every half-truth catalogued, every distraction accounted for. Hamish's patience, his quiet, lazy demeanour, had lured them into the one place where they were completely exposed. Hands shaking, the culprit finally released the parcel, stumbling backward in resignation. Hamish reached down, lifting it carefully and letting Towser remain calm, tongue lolling in silent approval. The confrontation, messy in tension but precise in execution, had ended as it needed to, without violence, without fuss, and with the culprit fully revealed by their own nervous movements. Elspeth, standing slightly behind, observed the scene with quiet satisfaction. "You made them think they were in control," she said softly. "Aye," Hamish replied. "Sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to let the person reveal themselves. No shouting, no bluster, just patience and observation. They always give themselves away." The culprit, now fully subdued, sank against the wall, breath coming in quick bursts, eyes wide and humiliated. The subtlety of their plan, the careful orchestration, the pride in their petty triumph, all had unravelled under the quiet pressure of a constable who appeared lazy, unremarkable, and entirely ordinary. And now the truth lay bare, as delicate and exacting as the glitter and scarf left behind. Hamish led the culprit toward the hotel, each step measured, ensuring no further. Mischief or panic could interfere. Blair, emerging belatedly with the constables, was breathless, already preparing a lecture for the public on his supposed insight. Hamish allowed him the satisfaction. Blair's need to be the hero was, as always, entirely predictable. By the time they reached the lounge, the The village had begun to stir in curiosity, drawn by the faint whispers and the slow movement of the group. Lady Camilla fluttered, observing with dramatic astonishment, while Mr. MacTavish hovered nervously nearby, relieved that the spectacle was drawing to a close. Hamish handed over the parcel, the culmination of careful observation and patience, and allowed Blair to step forward with his customary bluster, taking credit as expected. Hamish leaned back in his chair, Towser settling at his feet, and sipped his tea, eyes on the gentle glow of the fire. The culprit had been revealed, the motive uncovered. Petty human vanity, jealousy, and the need for attention masked by a performance of mischief, and the village, as always, had whispered its secrets in half-glances and careful movements. Blair would triumph loudly in the eyes of outsiders, but Hamish, quietly, had solved the case entirely on his own terms. Elspeth joined him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "And no one will know just how much you did?" she asked. Hamish shrugged lazily, a small secretive smile curling at the corners of his mouth. "Better that way. The village returns to normal, the spectacle ends, and I stay here, with the mist, the mountains, and a dog who knows the truth better than most people. Let Blair take the glory. My concern is Lochdu, not promotion." Towser yawned, curling into a warm coil at Hamish's feet. Outside, the village exhaled quietly, the tension of days past dissipating in the soft evening fog, chiming church bells fading into the mountains. Hamish leaned back, allowing the quiet comfort of the fire and the lingering aroma of tea and shortbread to wash over him. The mystery was resolved, the subtle human motives exposed, and the delicate equilibrium of Lochdu restored. For Hamish Macbeth, the world was exactly as it should be, quiet, observant, and entirely under his careful, patient watch. And as the last light faded over the hills, he knew the village would sleep peacefully tonight, while he savoured a rare moment of satisfaction, content in the knowledge that he had once again seen what others could not, without anyone realising just how much he had done. The next morning dawned over Lochdu in a soft wash of silver light, the mist curling lazily around the rooftops, the mountains standing silent sentinels. Hamish Macbeth lingered by the chapel, Towser at his side, watching the village stretch and yawn into a day free of yesterday's tension. The culprit had been quietly escorted away, the parcel returned to its rightful owner, and Blair, of course, was already spinning his version of events into heroic triumph at the hotel lounge, entirely unaware that every deduction and subtle observation had originated from Hamish himself. The village moved gently back into its familiar rhythms. Shopkeepers reopened their doors, children laughed and darted down the alleys, and the postmistress, with a conspiratorial glance at Hamish, returned to sorting letters with a newfound lightness in her step. Even Lady Camilla, though perturbed by the lack of drama for her own ego, had retreated to her parlour to fuss over her latest finery, leaving the village to its quietude. Hamish strolled along the cobbled streets, sipping from his thermos and greeting villagers with his usual casual nods. He paused briefly at the bakery, where Mrs. Sinclair presented a tray of warm scones, eyes twinkling in an unspoken acknowledgement of his efforts. "For your trouble," she said lightly, though Hamish knew she meant far more than the words suggested. He accepted a scone and a cup of tea, savouring both in the calm morning air. Towser tugged at his sleeve, eager to investigate the faint traces of footprints in the soft frost, but Hamish allowed the dog only a gentle sniff and wag of the tail. The village had returned to its deceptive tranquillity, but Hamish knew better. He had seen the hidden motives, the subtle manipulations, and the quiet human pettiness that had caused the spectacle. Now all that remained was to ensure the peace endured without drawing undue attention to himself. Elspeth appeared beside him, her presence as reassuring as ever. "You've done it," she said softly, glancing toward the chapel where a few curious villagers were already beginning their casual morning observations. "Aye," Hamish replied, stretching his legs and leaning against the low stone wall. "The fall, the parcel, the glitter, the misdirections, they've all been resolved. The culprit has been revealed, but the village needn't know how thoroughly." He took a slow sip of his tea, eyes scanning the mist-softened streets. "Blair will take the credit, of course, and let him. It's simpler that way, and it keeps me where I belong." The detective chief inspector appeared suddenly at the end of the square, red-faced and triumphant, waving at anyone who would listen, proclaiming the case solved with his usual loud bravado. Villagers nodded politely, some exchanging amused glances, but none truly questioned the account. Hamish allowed himself a faint, satisfied smile. The world worked better when people believed what they wanted, while he quietly held the truth. Mr. MacTavish, who had spent the previous days fretting over his humiliation, approached Hamish cautiously. "I don't know how to thank you, Constable," he murmured. You saw things no one else noticed." Hamish shrugged lightly, as if it were no effort at all. Just keeping an eye. You'll find the village returns to normal soon enough. That's the best kind of resolution." The morning moved lazily forward. Towser sniffed along the edges of the streets. Children ran to greet the baker's dog, and the subtle rhythm of Lochdu resumed. Hamish found himself at his favourite bench by the hotel, tea in hand, watching the soft silver light dance across the rooftops and the mountains beyond. Life, as always, was a mixture of small chaos and quiet observation, and Hamish Macbeth had once again ensured that balance. He allowed himself a small, private smile, leaning back with the comfortable satisfaction of a job done without fuss. There would be gossip, of course, and Blair would enjoy his loud triumph, but the village itself, the slow, steady heartbeat of Lochdu, remained untouched, unshaken by spectacle or bluster. Hamish would return to his quiet routines, coffee in the morning, a scone or two, perhaps a gentle patrol with Towser, and the slow enjoyment of life in the Highlands. The mist thickened again in the late afternoon, curling along the hillsides, softening the edges of rooftops and mountains alike. Hamish sipped his tea once more, glancing at Towser, who yawned contentedly at his feet. The village was at peace. The subtle human dramas had been revealed and resolved, and the quiet truth, never loud, never boastful, rested entirely with him. In Lochdu, life moved on, predictable and deceptively simple, and Hamish Macbeth, the constable who appeared lazy, unassuming, and entirely ordinary, had once again observed what no one else could. He was content, knowing that the balance had been restored, the culprit accounted for, and that he could, for a few more days at least, continue enjoying his coffee, his scones, and the quiet, watchful pleasure of keeping Lochdu safe in his own quiet way. And as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the mist rolling gently over the hills, the village exhaled softly, as if in relief, while Hamish, content and patient, prepared for another day in the Highlands, secure in the knowledge that the subtle truths of human nature were always visible to those willing to notice, and that, in Lochdu, there were few. Better than he. The village returned to its gentle rhythm. Peace, quiet observation, and the slow, intricate patterns of Highland life carried on. And somewhere, amidst the mist, the mountains, and the curling smoke from chimneys, Hamish Macbeth rested, happy that the world had remained as it should, complicated in its subtleties, yet endlessly watchable for those with eyes to see.